We were really emotional and we cried happy tears, but sad as well. I think the healing will actually start.
It started with something small, a routine glance at her daughter's phone, a habit, nothing more. But in the span of a few seconds, that habit became a nightmare. A message. Short. Unassuming. Come to my office. She frowned. Her daughter was just down the hall. Why would she need to be summoned like this? Then another message. Delete this. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't a classmate texting after hours. This wasn't a mistake. The name at the top of the screen belonged to someone who was supposed to love and protect her child. Someone who lived under the same roof. She scrolled up. Message after message. Some vague, others not. Each one chipping away at the foundation of her world. A sickening realization took hold. Her hands shook as she turned to her daughter, the only sound in the room the dull hum of the television in the background. What is it? A hesitation, a flicker of something in her daughter's eyes, fear, shame, something else, before she looked away. And in that moment the mother knew. This wasn't paranoia, this wasn't overreacting, this was real. The room around her seemed to fade, replaced by one terrible, undeniable truth. Her daughter had been living in silence, carrying something no child should ever have to bear. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to turn back time to a moment before she knew. But there was no going back. Now there was only one thing left to do: fight. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that the fight was only just beginning. Because when she took the evidence to the authorities, she thought justice would come swiftly, that her child's suffering would finally end. She was wrong. This case would be dismissed before it even made it to trial. And when that happened, she would have two choices: accept it or defy the system itself. Most people wouldn't have had the strength to keep going, but this mother did. And because of that, a legal battle unlike any other was about to begin. Stay with us, because by the time this story ends, you'll see just how close justice came to slipping away.
Only on 11 Alive tonight, a mother filled with gratitude and relief after a historic case lands the man who raped her daughter in prison for life.
The Athens Clarke County District Attorney had dismissed the case last year, saying it didn't have enough evidence. 11 Alive investigator Rebecca Lindstrom explains how this case landed in front of a jury anyway.
It only took the jury 45 minutes to deliberate and find Michael Daniel guilty of rape, incest, and child molestation. For nearly a year, we have talked about Marsy's Law, the constitutionally protected rights given to victims in Georgia. And this is the case that started it all. Last May, 11 Alive was the only camera in the courtroom for the state's first Marsy's Law hearing, as a mother told the judge how the Athens Clarke County DA's office violated her daughter's rights. We're not showing the mother to protect the girl's identity. She was only 14 years old when her mom found disturbing text messages on her phone.
He was a lot of time asking her to come into our home office with him, and if she didn't respond, he would ask her to delete the messages.
But the day of the trial, without warning, the prosecutor dismissed the charges.
I was shocked, and then I became kind of angry because I wasn't understanding.
Today, proudly wearing a shirt proclaiming girl power, the mother remembers the judge finding for the first time in Georgia a DA's office guilty of violating Marsy's Law. About a month later, that same judge requested that a prosecutor outside of the DA's office look at the case.
If I didn't have these attorneys, we wouldn't have went back to court, but I also wouldn't have found out how bad they messed up our case because they just wanted me to think that it wasn't enough evidence.
This week, Michael Daniel went on trial, and the jury found him guilty on every count. The rape charge alone comes with a mandatory minimum of 25 years in prison.
And what it took to pull it back. For a moment, she couldn't move. The phone in her hands felt heavier than it should have. The words on the screen burned into her mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. Come to my office. Delete this. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammered in her ears. A part of her wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was misunderstanding. Maybe there was some context she was missing. But deep down, she knew better. He turned her head slowly to where her daughter sat, frozen, eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders tense, like she was bracing for something. A guilty child lies, a frightened child stays silent. And her daughter wasn't lying. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight, controlled, teetering on the edge of something she wasn't sure she could contain. No answer. She inhaled sharply. Her hands felt clammy. If she pushed too hard, would her daughter shut down? If she didn't push hard enough, would she never know the full truth? "Tell me." A slow, shuddering breath, then words, soft, hesitant, but enough to shatter whatever remained of her world. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She could hear her own breathing, shaky, uneven. And then rage. Not at her daughter, never at her daughter, at him. At the man who sat under the same roof. The man she had once trusted. The man who had built a carefully constructed illusion of normalcy while committing something unspeakable. She felt sick. Her mind raced, searching for answers, for next steps, for anything that would make sense of this. But nothing did. She knew only one thing: she had to act. She forced herself to stay calm, though every fiber of her being wanted to scream. If she reacted too strongly, if she broke down in front of her daughter, it might make her retreat further. "It's not your fault," she whispered. The girl nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes, because for victims, the guilt never seems to belong to the person it should. The mother stood, phone still clutched in her hand, her grip so tight her knuckles were white. She took a breath, one step at a time. First, she needed proof. She scrolled through the messages again, taking screenshots, every single one. She wouldn't let this disappear. Next, she needed help. Her fingers hovered over the call button. The police, that was the logical step. That's what you do when a crime is committed, isn't it? You go to the authorities, you trust them to do the right thing. But doubt crept in. Would they believe her? Would they take this seriously? Or would they hesitate, like so many others had in cases like these? No, she couldn't afford to think that way. This wasn't about hesitation, this wasn't about fear, this was about justice. She pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice. Then, 811, what's your emergency? Her voice didn't shake. I need to report a crime. She thought that would be the hardest part, that once she made the call, everything would fall into place, that the weight of this nightmare would finally shift onto the shoulders of those who could carry it. She had no idea what was coming next. Because soon she would learn the hardest truth of all, that getting justice wasn't just about telling the truth. It was about forcing the system to listen. And the system wasn't ready to hear her. She thought she had done everything right. She reported the crime. She handed over the evidence. She sat across from investigators, recounting every painful detail, reliving the nightmare, so the system could do what it was built to do, deliver justice. But justice isn't a straight path. It's not swift, nor is it guaranteed, and for victims of sexual assault, justice is often the exception, not the rule. At first, things moved quickly. The police took her statement, her daughter was interviewed, a case was opened, Michael Loreco Daniel was arrested. For a brief moment, she let herself breathe. But she didn't know the fight was only beginning. The case was handed to the Athens-Clarke County District Attorney's Office. Prosecutor Robert Wilson was assigned to take it to trial. The mother was told there was a strong case, that the evidence was damning, that the system was on their side. Then, the waiting began. Weeks passed, then months. The trial date was set, then delayed, then set again. And then the unthinkable happened. A phone call, a voice she had come to know too well. "I need you to come in." Her stomach tightened. Something was wrong. She sat across from the prosecutor, her daughter beside her, their hands entwined. Then he said the word she never saw coming. "We have to dismiss the case?" The room blurred. She blinked. "What?" "We don't have enough evidence." Her grip on her daughter's hand tightened. That didn't make sense. They had the text messages, they had the testimony, they had everything. She shook her head. "You said." "I know what I said." His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered, like a man who knew he was about to deliver a death sentence. Then the truth came out. A mistake, a failure. The prosecution had forgotten to subpoena a key witness. A witness whose testimony could have solidified the case. And without it, the defense had filed a motion to dismiss. The judge had granted it. Her daughter's case erased. The mother couldn't speak. Her daughter sat rigid beside her, eyes blank, face unreadable. It was happening, the thing she feared most. The system was failing them. "So that's it?" she finally asked. The prosecutor exhaled. You can file an appeal." She stared at him. An appeal, like this was a lost insurance claim. A formality, a technicality, a child's life reduced to paperwork. She looked at her daughter, the girl who had found the courage to speak, who had faced the world despite the shame, the fear, the doubt. And now the world was telling her that her truth wasn't enough. No, that wasn't how this was going to end. The mother stood. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know the ins and outs of the legal system. But she knew one thing. She was not going to let them get away with this. She would fight, even if she had to tear the system apart to make it listen. What happened next would make history, because this case wasn't just about one girl anymore. It was about every survivor who had been silenced before her. And this time the system would have no choice but to listen. The legal system had made its decision. The case was dismissed. That should have been the end of it. Most families would have been forced to accept it. Most survivors would have been left to pick up the broken pieces of their lives, knowing the person who hurt them would never face consequences. But this mother wasn't most people. She refused to accept that her daughter's pain could be erased with a simple legal misstep. She refused to let a failure in the system silence them. If the courts thought they could walk away from this case without a fight, they had no idea who they were up against. She began searching for answers, spending sleepless nights poring over legal documents, looking for anything that could force the case back into the courtroom. That's when she found him. Attorney Kevin Epps. A man known for challenging the system, a man who didn't back down, a man who looked at this case and saw something bigger than just one family's fight. When he took the mother's call, she told him everything, the evidence, the text messages, the trial that never happened. And then, the moment that changed everything, they dismissed the case without even telling us first. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, a shift. Because that one detail meant something huge. A violation of Marsy's Law. Marsy's Law was designed to protect the rights of crime victims, to ensure they were not just witnesses in their own cases, but active participants. Under this law, victims had the right to be notified of hearings, the right to be heard, the right to fight back against decisions that could impact their case. And that right had been violated. The prosecutor had failed to inform them before the case was dismissed. That one mistake, the system's failure, not theirs. Epps filed a lawsuit, not to convict the accused, but to hold the justice system itself accountable. Legal experts watched in disbelief. This had never been done before. A dismissed case doesn't just get revived, a second chance at trial doesn't just happen. But this time, the courts had no choice. A judge ruled in their favor. The dismissal was invalid. The case wasn't over. It had never been over. The Athens Clerk County District Attorney's Office was forced to step aside. They'd lost the right to prosecute the case after their failure. The state appointed a new prosecutor, District Attorney Randy McGinley. He reviewed the evidence. Everything pointed to guilt. And this time, there would be no mistakes. Michael Loreco Daniel was reindicted. The mother sat in the courtroom once again, but this time it felt different. Because now she knew something the system had tried to teach her wasn't true. Justice wasn't given, it was taken, fought for, won. And this fight wasn't over yet. Because now, after everything, they were finally going to trial. The courtroom was packed. The air was heavy with tension, thick with the weight of what was at stake. The mother sat in the front row, her daughter beside her. Their hands were clasped together, gripping tight, as if letting go meant losing control. Across the room sat Michael Loreco Daniel, the man who had stolen her daughter's innocence, the man the system had nearly set free. But not this time. This time there would be no procedural mistakes, no technicalities to hide behind, no loopholes for him to slip through. This time, justice was watching. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the facts, the text messages, the testimony, the pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The jury sat still, their faces unreadable, but their eyes told another story. They saw it. They felt it. Then came the mother. She took the stand, steady, unshaken. She spoke about the moment she found the messages, about the fear, about the desperate attempt to make sense of something no mother should ever have to face. She recounted the betrayal, the helplessness, the battle she had fought just to get this far. The defense tried to rattle her, to poke holes in her memory, to twist her words into something they weren't. But she never wavered, because the truth doesn't break. Then came her daughter. She walked to the stand slowly, every step measured, deliberate. For so long she had been silenced, doubted, stripped of the control she should have had over her own story. Not anymore. She spoke in a voice that did not tremble. She told them what had happened. She looked her father in the eye and said the words that could never be unsaid. The defense tried to discredit her. She was young, maybe she was confused, maybe she was exaggerating. But the jury saw what the defense couldn't erase. They saw the truth. Then came the evidence. The messages, the deleted texts, the proof that this wasn't some misunderstanding, some lapse in judgment. This was calculated, this was deliberate, this was a crime. And when the prosecution rested, there was nothing left to question. The jury left to deliberate. The mother sat motionless, her daughter's hands still gripping hers. The minutes felt like hours, the weight of the past years pressing down on them. Then movement. The jury was back. They filed in, faces unreadable. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. A woman in the front row, the foreperson, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent. Guilty on every charge. The mother exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Tears filled her daughter's eyes, not from sadness, not from fear, but from something else. Relief. Then came the sentencing. Judge Thomas L. Hodges III looked at Michael Loreco Daniel, a man who had manipulated, coerced, and abused the trust of his own child. And he handed down a sentence that left no room for doubt. Life in prison, and as if that weren't enough, an additional 50 years. The courtroom buzzed. The weight of those words settled over everyone. Daniel sat motionless, his face unreadable. It didn't matter, because this time he didn't have control. This time he wasn't the one who got to walk away. The mother turned to her daughter, pulling her close, whispering the words she had waited so long to say. "It's over." But even as those words left her lips, she knew the truth. For them, this was a victory, but for so many others, the fight was just beginning. Because for every case that ends in justice, there are hundreds more that don't. And that was something she could never forget. The verdict was in, the sentence was handed down, justice had been served. At least, that's what people wanted to believe. The mother and daughter walked out of the courtroom into the crisp Georgia air, the weight of the last few years pressing down on them. It was over. The fight they never should have had to fight was finally won. And yet, why didn't it feel like a victory? Because for every Michael Loreco Daniel who is convicted, there are countless others who aren't. For every mother who refuses to stay silent, there are thousands who have screamed into the void, only to be met with closed doors and legal loopholes. And that's the reality no one likes to talk about. This case, as horrifying as it was an exception. Most victims never see a courtroom. Most cases never make it past the initial investigation. And even when they do, the odds are against them. According to studies, out of every 1,000 cases of sexual assault, only 310 are reported to the police. Out of those, only 50 lead to an arrest. And in the end, fewer than 25 result in a conviction. Less than 3%. That's what justice looks like for survivors. And the worst part? The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to. A system that values efficiency over truth. A system that allows prosecutors to dismiss cases simply because they don't want to risk a loss. A system that expects victims to prove their pain beyond all doubt while the accused are given the benefit of it. And when a case is dismissed, that's it. Survivors are expected to move on, to bury their trauma, to forget. But how do you forget something that shattered your world? The mother in this case had refused to let the system win. She had fought against something most people never dared to challenge. But should she have had to? Why did it take a historic lawsuit to force the courts to do what they should have done from the beginning? And more importantly, how many others have been denied that same chance? Because this is the truth people don't want to hear. Most survivors don't lose their cases in the courtroom. They lose them long before that. They lose them the moment investigators hesitate. They lose them when their credibility is questioned before their abusers is. They lose them when prosecutors decide that a conviction isn't worth the effort. They lose them when society makes them feel that silence is safer than speaking. And for those who do make it through the system, they are left exhausted, drained, broken down by a battle they never should have had to fight in the first place. Justice shouldn't be this difficult to achieve. Survivors shouldn't have to be warriors just to be heard. And yet, case after case, that's exactly what they are forced to become. So what does that mean for the future? It means that this case cannot be forgotten. It means that Marcy's law must be enforced every single time. It means that prosecutors must be held accountable when they fail the very people they are sworn to protect. And it means that survivors need more than just words. They need action. Because this case, it was a victory. But the war is far from over. The fight in that courtroom may have ended, but the fight for justice, that never stops. This case was rare. Justice was served, but only because one mother refused to be silenced. Because she went beyond what most people would have dared to do. She took on the system. She forced it to listen. But here's the truth no one wants to admit. It shouldn't take this much effort to hold an abuser accountable. For every survivor who sees a courtroom, there are countless others who don't. Their voices are ignored, their cases are dismissed, their truth is buried beneath a system that was never built to protect them in the first place. And that is where the real injustice lies. How many more cases like this are out there? How many victims are still waiting for someone, anyone, to fight for them? How many stories never get told? The legal system won't fix itself. Laws alone won't protect survivors. Justice doesn't happen just because it should. It happens because people demand it, because people refuse to look away. And that's why you're here. Because if this case has taught us anything, it's that exposing the truth changes everything. So if you believe that stories like this need to be heard, if you believe that justice should never be a privilege but a right, then do something about it. Subscribe. Not just to this channel, subscribe to the idea that these stories matter, that victims deserve to be heard, that justice shouldn't be reserved for the few who are lucky enough to fight long enough to get it. Because as long as these cases keep happening, as long as the system continues to fail, as long as survivors are still being silenced, we won't stop telling these stories. Because the moment we stop talking about it, the moment we stop paying attention, that's when the next case gets dismissed. That's when another victim is told their pain doesn't matter. That's when another predator walks free. And we are not going to let that happen. So if you're with us, if you believe in shining a light on the cases others would rather forget, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this isn't just true crime.